Hello and welcome to another episode of the Fully Charged Show podcast. My name is Robert Llewellyn. I'm the founder and one of the hosts of this extraordinary channel. It's been going for 13 years now. And we have over a million subscribers on the Fully Charged Show channel. We have many tens of thousands on the Everything Electric channel, where this is hosted alongside the normal audio versions. We obviously, most people just listen to this podcast, but some people do watch. There's not much to see. It's two people talking. And I'm very glad to welcome you here. And I do hope that you will do the very normal and annoying and boring thing of subscribing and telling your friends, because it does help. It does make a difference. And we do have the most extraordinary people on this show regularly. This week is clearly no exception to that. Now, one of the things we've noticed, and I do mention this at the beginning of this conversation, is that when we, in the past, when we've mentioned the word climate in any way in the title, in the heading, in the thumbnail, we get really noticeably less views. We're talking about on the Fully Charged Show, like videos, where we barely ever mention the topic. It basically has become the C word. We just don't talk about it because there's plenty of other things to talk about, and it's not really in our general remit. That's not what the channel is about. It's not what we're arguing about, but it is without question the very quiet but extremely large elephant in the room. The really important arguments about ground transport are cleaning the air for human beings. Forget climate. Let's just actually breathe air that's decent to breathe, rather than really toxic, carcinogenic soup filth that's coming out of the back of hundreds of millions of exhaust pipes around the world. That's what we're really talking about. And how do you heat your home without burning gas? And how do you cook without burning gas? And how do you generate electricity without burning gas and coal? Those are the kind of key features. But the background to that is clearly that the activities we've all been doing and benefiting from for the last 150 to 200 years are now, it is obvious, having an effect on the planet that we all live on. It's not about saving the planet, which I do mention. The planet does not give a flying toss what we do. The planet is fine. It's us. It's all the living creatures on the surface of the planet that are in a bit of trouble. So that's what we're talking about. And I am talking to an absolutely delightful, gentle, calm man, Professor Ed Hawkins, who works at the National Centre for Atmospheric Science at Reading University. And he's very familiar with not only his subject, which is incredibly complex, diverse, has enormous amounts of nuance and complexity, and what's happening in the world and the history of the way the climate is altering and all those things. Not only that, but he also is aware of all the arguments against, that people are saying, oh, there is no climate change, or there is climate change, but it's nothing to do with human beings. It's the sun, or all those things. So we do discuss all those things, which is amazing. And then what I did was ask a question on Threads, if anyone had any questions. And what's really good, a lot of people answered, which is new for me. It's not the old it's Threads. Lots of people replied, way more than I expected, because Threads is clearly now absolutely blooming. In case you don't know, it's the thing that, I'm leaving one social media platform that's run by a barking mad multi-billionaire that no one will ever dare say no to, for another barking mad multi-billionaire, Mr. Zuckerberg. And so it's part of Instagram, in case you don't know. And if you've got an Instagram account, you've already got a Threads account. It's very easy to set up. It's grown very, very rapidly. It grew ridiculously rapidly when they started it, but it's now becoming a lot more usable. A lot more people are using it rather than just signing up for it. Why did I mention that? Oh, yes, because of all the questions. Well, what was really good was, of course, I didn't see the responses to that until after we'd done the recording. But what was great is about 80% of the questions people asked, I asked him, and that's what we were talking about. So I've covered most of them. There's one or two critically important things that annoyingly I didn't, but what is, without question, I really want to get Ed back to ask some more stuff and have another discussion with him, and he's willing to do that. So he is a wonderful man. So That's enough of a rambling intro. So please do welcome to the Fully Charged podcast, Professor Ed Hawkins. So Ed, thank you so much for joining us today. It's very good of you to give up your valuable time, because I know you're a busy person.
You're very welcome.
But this is, so just to explain, so Fully Charged show's been going for 13 and a half years. And I have mentioned the word climate on the show every now and then. And if we put the word climate in the title of an episode, even if it's utterly sort of remotely related to it, the views drop by tens, if not hundreds of thousands.
Interesting.
And we also get enormous and tedious sort of pushback from, I don't know, clever men who know more about the climate than you do.
I see a lot of this online as well, yes.
But so we're taking a big risk now. But I mean, the thing is that it's always the elephant in the room. I mean, the reason that I got interested in electric ground transport really was nothing to do with climate or particulates or air pollution. I was kind of intrigued by the technology, and that's what was intriguing. And then in a sense, the economics of that technology and how that's changed, which we've covered in great detail. But the background of all that is that understanding. And can we just go through, just to start with, some of the most common things that I hear
Sure.
as to why you have no idea what you're talking about, and there's men on X who know far more. Okay, let's start with the very first one. I can't remember ever seeing a comment or a tweet or anything from a woman. I'm sure there's some very angry women who think climate change is a massive con, but it does seem to be fairly male-focused, the resistance, or the denialism. Is that something you've been aware of?
I certainly see more men commenting online. That's certainly true. And I think we often see worse abuse targeted at female climate scientists as well. Yeah.
No, I'm sure. So, I'm just going to. I actually saved this. This was one because I'm now no longer on Twitter, and I have to say,
sensible choice.
My life has improved. I'm so much happier. But anyway, this must have been. I can't imagine what anyone said. I don't know what the conversation was, but this is what I won't use his name because it's not fair. Please stop comparing past climate periods to the current optimum. None have been as extended, and many have been warmer over shorter periods. We are experiencing a climate optimum and may do for some time. We can but adapt to it or perish. So that was kind of, that one caught me because I went, he's using some complicated terms there. I then looked at his timeline, his previous tweets. They are, I'm going to say it bluntly, extremely right-wing. Not like a bit conservative. They are beyond Farage. So, it's the only way I can describe them. And that's perfectly legitimate to have those opinions. But it is interesting that's the other thing. So very few women have made these comments that I've seen, and very few sort of even annoying lefty activists. They're not arguing about this. How did that happen? How did that become politicized in that way? Because essentially, I made my argument always about electric cars. They're not political. It's bloody technology. It's cars made in factories out of materials we dig out of the ground. Well, how can that be political? Then how can the research you're doing, and I don't know how many other scientists, but a lot.
Yeah, so I mean, there's obviously thousands of climate scientists around the world, all trying to do our best to understand our climate's past, our climate's present, and our climate's future, and what that means for people and society and biodiversity and ecosystems around the world. And I think much of this aversion to the science and those trying to push back against the science comes from the fact that they don't like the proposed solutions.
Right.
And I think that's where it comes from ultimately, and they want to find an excuse not to do anything because they don't like the proposed solutions.
Yeah. So I mean, if you had come up with the idea that we're in this trouble because of low CO2, can you please keep your diesel cars running overnight, just ticking over? The reaction would have been very different.
It would have been very different, yes.
We need as much CO2 as we can possibly generate. let's drill more oil and just burn it. That is interesting then. So it is that you feel that's the major kind of driving force behind it.
And, clearly also the fossil fuel companies are behind a lot of this as well, that they have known for decades. Back in the 80s, they were doing their own research into understanding the consequences of burning fossil fuels on the atmosphere. And they very clearly understood at the time that adding CO2 to the atmosphere would warm the climate. And that got buried because they didn't like what that meant for their businesses. And they have been funding a disinformation campaign ever since.
Right. Because, I rave on and on, in a futile way about the fossil fuel lobby. And, there are times when I sort of catch myself going, I should be sure what I'm saying here. This is quite a broad brush accusation. And it's kind of in almost lazy shorthand to say, well, of course I say that because they're the fossil fuel lobby. But they do exist.
But they definitely
as an industry, it exists. Yeah.
Very much.
Right. And is that something that you would discuss with your peers within that? Because I don't know. Presumably you do occasionally have to discuss not the science, but how you communicate the science and how you counter some of the
we discuss the communication an awful lot. And I think the one thing that we sort of all agree on is that there's no right way of doing this. That there's no one size fits all. Different arguments are going to be needed to respond to different groups of people. Everyone has different values, and therefore, if you're going to talk about these issues to any group, you need to understand their values, where they come from, where the resistance points are likely to be, and tailor your message to tackle the issues which they are going to find important to them.
Yeah. And and also, is it, would you say it's fairly generational? I'm sure there's going to be young people that are mad conspiracy theorists, flat earthers, anti-vaxxers. I don't even want to think. What I'm quite depressed about my generation is there's a lot of gentle old hippies that I've known all my life that I used to know when I had very, very long hair, who've become the most ridiculous sort of pro-Trump, anti-vax, flat earth, everything's a conspiracy theory, and anti-Semitic, shocking racism. I don't know where that's come from, and that's just come out of the woodwork somewhere.
It's definitely true that most of the abuse I get online comes from older white men. Right.
So when you lecture to your students at university, you don't have one at the back going, "It's a global Jewish conspiracy to crush our freedom."
No, we don't have much of that. No, it's fair to say.
But that's one of the. There are some. I've made the bad mistake, even though I've left Twitter, of going onto Twitter and just putting in #climate. I shouldn't have done it, but so that what is the? So give us the argument about very obviously the Earth has been much colder and much warmer than it is today historically, as far as I understand it.
Yeah, since the planet's been around, the climate has gone up and it's gone down. It's been colder, it's been hotter than it is now. And there are, any number of different reasons for those changes that have happened over millions of years, hundreds of thousands of years. Right. The continents have moved around through plate tectonics, and that obviously changes the climate. We've had periods of intense volcanism, for example, on the planet. The sun has been brighter and dimmer at various times in the past as well. And all of these factors, have contributed to very slow changes in our climate in the past. And over the last, million years nearly, we've gone through a period of ice ages and periods between the ice ages, which are much warmer. And so we see this, and this is where climate science began. In the 1820s, we suddenly realized at the time that, how did these valleys in the Alps get here? Right. It must have been much colder in the past for the ice to carve out these enormous valleys. How do we explain that? How do we explain the planet's temperature? The planet should actually be a lot colder than it is, given our position in the solar system.
Right.
And in the 1820s, the famous French mathematician Joseph Fourier worked out that, according to him, the planet should be minus 20 degrees centigrade, given where we are.
Over the whole planet, yeah.
Yeah, given the energy coming in from the sun and where we are. And what he didn't understand at the time and didn't realize was that, there is essentially something in the atmosphere, which means that the planet acts like a greenhouse. And he used that term in the 1820s. He didn't understand what that was, but he could see that it would have to be there to explain why the planet was so warm. And it took until the 1850s and 1860s for us to have a first idea of what that was in the atmosphere that was essentially acting as a blanket and making the planet a habitable place to live. And so Eunice Foote and John Tyndall are the two scientists credited with that, who identified water vapor and carbon dioxide and methane as being the important greenhouse gases that we all talk about today.
Right. And if so, I mean, that kind of clarifies some things. If there was no methane or carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, would it, or water vapor, it would be a lot colder.
It would be a ball of ice. Yeah.
Right. So that's quite so that, because I think that's often the argument is like, we need CO2 for the. I'm sorry, I'm trying not to do silly voices from people. We need CO2 because our plants absorb it, and that's what makes them grow and all that stuff.
We need CO2 in the atmosphere, right? Yeah. And before the Industrial Revolution, we had a certain amount of CO2 in the atmosphere, along with methane and water vapor, which meant that there was liquid water on the surface, life could develop and flourish. And so that level is clearly very important. But it also demonstrates there is a greenhouse effect, which we can make worse. And I think that's a really important point, is that there is this natural greenhouse effect, which is essential for life on Earth. And what we are doing is adding to that natural greenhouse effect, amplifying how strong it is, and therefore warming the planet further.
Right. And that's one, that's the thing. It's quite hard to understand, as a lay person. One of the things I looked up many years ago was what the amount of CO2 per whatever, that measurement.
Yes.
When I was born. So I was born in 1956 and it was 314 parts of CO2 per million.
Yes.
And I'm 67 years old. So, and now it's over 400.
420, yes.
400. So it's gone up over 100 parts per million in my lifetime. Now, is that geologically speaking, or planet history speaking, fast?
It's gone up incredibly quickly, and I think that's the really important point to emphasize about when we look back in our past and compare the climate of the past and the CO2 levels of the past. These things happened on very, very slow timescales. It happened over tens of thousands of years, hundreds of thousands of years. What we have done is change the climate in a unrecognizable way in 50 years. And it's that rapidity of the change which is so unusual, and therefore causing more consequences, because it's just harder for anything to adjust when things are changing very, very quickly compared to when things are changing very slowly.
Yeah. And it does seem to be, I've got the feeling now that there are more people accepting it as, if nothing else, it's annoying. That side of it. They're like just general people in the world. So I live in a village that's quite high up in the Cotswolds in the west of England. And when we moved here, which is 32 years ago, the first 2 winters we were here, it was no big deal, but we were actually cut off by snow for like a day. And then Jim would get his tractor out and dig through the snow and we could get out onto the main road. So we're on a little lane off a main road. That hasn't happened for, I think, 28 years, not once. Yep. And in fact, for the last 10 years, we've had no snow. Well, there's loads of documentary evidence, and my parents grew up in this area, of proper deep snow drifts and people stuck here for days. And, that happened in my parents' lifetime, and it's just stopped. My kids are now grown up and they couldn't, there's no point them coming back to go tobogganing because they'll have to go down some mud. That change, I can tell from people in the village, from old people in the village, from young people, they can see that's different now.
We don't need our thermometers to tell us what's going on, right? We have enough evidence from photographs of how it was in the past, and the evidence of more snow in the past. Even I remember more snow in my childhood. We have photographs taken from satellites of the Arctic. And the enormous melt, we lost a third of our ice in the Arctic. This is direct evidence of the natural world telling us that our planet is warming. It's undeniable.
Yeah. So, I think the thing that we all have to do, in terms of people who aren't buying into the sort of conspiracy theories, is ignore those people and actually get on and do something about it. Because I don't want to argue with someone who says those things. It's just pointless waste of time.
I started off when I was communicating, trying to have these discussions with people, and it very quickly became apparent that there's no point. You will not change their mind with facts or evidence. Yeah. They will always cherry pick something which they've heard somewhere, which they think counteracts everything you've just said. And they're just averse to the solutions. And you're absolutely right. We need to work on talking to the vast majority who do want to do something about this and tackle it and do something quite serious in response to the challenges we face.
I mean, can I ask how you got involved in how you ended up doing what you're doing now? I mean, what your path to get to where you are now was?
Yeah, so I started life actually as an astrophysicist. I did a PhD in astrophysics, studying distant galaxies.
Right.
And I came to the end of my PhD and thought, I actually want to do something a bit more down to earth, a bit more
local,
a bit more relevant. And so through a roundabout route, I ended up in climate science and have stayed there ever since.
Right.
But, having that background, meant that I was able to come in, I think, and ask stupid questions, which are always important to ask stupid questions, and learn about the history of how we know what we know. And so coming in afresh, I think, was very helpful to try and understand the basics of where we've got to and how we know what we know today.
Yeah. Because one of the things, because it is that where that evidence comes from, I find absolutely fascinating. So can you briefly explain an ice core? When people drill the really long, because I just think the snow bit or this icy bit is like 2 foot deep in the Arctic, or it's like, how can you do that?
It's quite deep. I mean, if you go to Greenland or Antarctica, there's a very, very deep layer of ice, and you can drill through it. And every year the snow gets laid down and forms layers, and so you can see these layers stacked one upon the other, and you can count those layers, count back through time. Right. And so people go and drill these enormously long ice cores, take them back to the lab to analyze, and you can simply count the number of layers going back through time. And when you slice up the different layers, those you see these beautiful pictures of the ice core containing these air bubbles. And what you do is that you melt the water, extract the air that is in those bubbles, and that is the air that was laid down with the ice however long ago it was.
Right.
And so, you can examine the air from 100,000 years ago and understand how much carbon dioxide was in the atmosphere at the time, how much methane was in the atmosphere at the time. And from the chemistry of the ice, the water in the ice, you can also infer something about the temperature at that time as well. And so we have all these rather clever ways of trying to work out what was going on in the atmosphere and how hot it was at the particular time that ice layer was laid down. And so that's how we build up a picture of how the climate has changed over the last million years or so, which we can do from ice cores.
But I mean, you can actually do 100,000 years. There's 100,000 layers. You can go down that far.
These ice cores go back several 100,000 years. I think they're trying to drill a new one at the moment to go back 1 million years in Antarctica. And that's as far back as we can go with ice.
Right.
Yeah.
That is bonkers. So what other ways could you then go back in time and witness that? I mean, is there other systems you can use?
So, go further back. There's all kinds of geological evidence and little fossilized creatures buried in mud cores and all kinds of other clever things, which is not my area of expertise.
Right.
But clever people study this a lot and can infer something about what the climate was doing all the way back through time. We see fossils evidence as well. And more recently, for the more recent period, we can look at tree rings and we can look at corals, which also have layers in them and growth layers, and all kinds of other things which tell us a lot about the climate at the time that those things were growing.
But then from a kind of individual level, it seems like you look up at the sky and it looks really big.
Yes.
And you go around the world. I have flown around the world. It's ever so big. It takes a long time to go around, even in a really fast aeroplane.
Yeah.
And then I think, well, my little exhaust pipe or my chimney burning coal, I mean, that can't have, on that individual level, you go, how can that have an impact?
So, I mean, it's true, it does seem surprising, that we can have such a large impact. And in fact, if you if you go back and read some of the historical papers that started off climate science, in 1938, an amateur scientist called Guy Callender published the first paper which showed that the planet was warming. Right. So we spotted that in 1938.
1938. Wow.
A long time ago. And he also put together an understanding of how much the levels of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere had increased at that time. Right. And he did a very quick back-of-the-envelope calculation and said, yeah, the amount of warming we're seeing is pretty much what we expect to happen given the amount that carbon dioxide has increased in the atmosphere. And then you read the comments that people wrote at the time, the academic comments, and they were going, there's no way that we can be affecting the climate like this. There's a loss of, it's too big. How can we possibly, and then, so from there, our understanding built, it developed, we became more certain about the role that the greenhouse gases were playing. And yes, we were certain that what we're doing, burning fossil fuels and deforestation, is adding all these greenhouse gases to the atmosphere, changing the climate, and of that we are now certain.
Yeah. And also, if you think about the simple numbers that are associated with the extraction, refinement, and consumption of all that fossil fuel. I mean, back then they were dealing with a couple of teaspoonfuls, whereas now we've got a high pressure pump.
So in 1861, John Tyndall wrote that if we change the levels of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere, it will change the climate. But at that time, they were burning hardly anything, and so they did not expect to see the changes because they couldn't foresee the enormous growth brought about by the Industrial Revolution. Yeah. I
mean, I think, and the other thing that I do sympathise with, because it's because we are all implicitly involved in it, is that you and I are here, really because of fossil fuel. Our world is built on fossil fuel. Everything that we do, our food, I can walk to the shop in recycled shoes and be a vegan, and that food has been delivered probably in a diesel van, so there's no way you can not be involved in it. And I mean, that's my argument, is then we need to change that, and let's not use diesel van. Yes, to use, but that, I think that acknowledgement, I feel helps me understand my role in this, and and everyone else's. It's not that, fossil fuel's bad, it's really bad. Well, yeah, it is. We now understand that, but it's been an incredible benefit to the human race as well.
It has, absolutely. I mean, society has developed and flourished. Technology, medicine, food, as you say. It's all because that we have learnt to use that to generate our energy.
Right.
And what we're seeing now are the side effects. We didn't understand that, at the time, and we very clearly do now. And so those side effects we now realise are pretty serious, and that we can find alternative ways of generating the energy that we need to power society going forwards, and that we can do that in a way which doesn't damage the climate.
Yeah, because I mean, I think that's that's the key thing, and it's I think, and whenever I talk about it, I've got to actually do a talk next week. I haven't done one for a while. I always start off by saying electric cars won't save the world. They're not the answer, and we're all here because of fossil fuels. I mean, that's like, start there and then work back. But then when I first talked about electric vehicles, I used to do a talk that was titled "Electric Cars Are Rubbish, Aren't They?" One sentence, no question mark. It's just a statement, and that I then adapt, because I could sense the change. I'm talking 12 years ago. And then I could sense a change in the audiences. And I said, so I then changed it to electric cars are rubbish, full stop. New paragraph, aren't they? Question mark. It was all to do with how the thing was laid out. I get the feeling that there is a sort of shift in global public opinion due to just the catastrophic amount of catastrophic weather events, particularly in the last couple of years. It really it feels like it's wrapped up. Well, you could argue that it's the reporting, because it's dramatic, it gets more more airtime, if you like.
I think we've often focused on climate change affecting people in the future. And I think that's been a problem, because it's always been about our children, and trying to improve the climate for our children and the next generations to come, which kind of has slightly absolved us a bit of responsibility, I think. Whereas now what we're seeing is that it's not something for the future, it's here and now. In every extreme weather event that we've seen over this summer and last summer, all of the heat waves, many of the wildfires we've seen, many of the floods we've seen have all been made worse because the fact that climate is warmer.
Yeah.
Every heat wave is hotter because of climate change.
Right.
When we get these enormous downpours of heavy rain, like we had in Scotland the other day, or in Libya or in Greece, wherever we've seen it, more rain is coming out of the sky because we live in a warmer world, and therefore the risk of flooding increases. More people are flooded, more businesses suffer, and sadly we see more people dying because of that. Yeah. And the same with the wildfires, in the Mediterranean and in Australia. These places, many of these places are getting drier and they're getting hotter, which means the conditions for wildfires become ever more dangerous. And so we are influencing the weather, we're influencing these extreme events and making them more hurtful, more damaging, more devastating. And we're seeing those consequences very clearly on the news now. And so, yes, climate change is here and it's now. And we now can see that, I think, more clearly. And it's up to our generation to respond.
Yeah. And I mean, is that certainly a thing I've had a conversation about with like-minded, wishy-washy liberals like me. So not a kind of dramatic, rejection of it all, but it's how quickly any change in our behavior, like on a global level, on a kind of industrial, corporate, massive governmental level, how quickly that might result in actual sort of changes, like a reduction in, say, that we get CO2 parts per million down to just below 400. Is that going to take decades, hundreds of years, thousands of years?
So at the moment, we're focusing on just stopping it increasing.
Right.
That is the order one objectives that we have, because even doing that is an enormous challenge. To reach global net zero is a huge, enormous, unfathomable challenge in many ways.
Right.
But achieving that is the only way we stop the globe warming up further.
Right.
And so again, at the moment, we're just aiming to stop the globe getting warmer. We're not aiming at currently really to cool the planet down, because that is even harder. Right. If we want to do that, we then have to work out a way of extracting CO2 from the atmosphere in huge quantities, and we just do not know how to do that in any effective way yet. Maybe we can learn how to do that over the coming decades. But this is why it's a cumulative problem. Every ton of carbon dioxide we add to the atmosphere will affect us for generations. Right. We're just aiming to stop things getting worse at the moment. And that's what we'll achieve by net zero. So we're not aiming to go backwards. We're not aiming to reduce CO2 back to whatever level we might want at the moment. Maybe we could achieve that at some point if we want to. But at the moment, we just need to stop things getting worse.
Yeah.
And we're going to have to live with the consequences. Those heat waves and floods and wildfires are not going to become less intense. They're just going to stop becoming more intense. And so we are going to have to live and suffer with the consequences we've already got. And we will need to adapt our society to deal with those consequences as well.
Yeah. I mean, it's very difficult not to remember, because I don't think I'm very happy to accept that it was weather, but we've lived here long enough, and I've lived in this country long enough to know that quite high up in the Cotswolds, where it's generally 5 degrees cooler here than it is, say, outside London, it's a really noticeable difference. We went over 40 degrees last year for 2 days. That has never happened. And I've experienced those sort of temperatures in Australia. My wife's Australian. I've lived there a lot. That was Australian weather in an English house. They don't mix.
No, exactly. And this is the problem that we face. Society has been built on a climate of the past.
Yeah,
right? We're adapted. We build our roads, our railways, our buildings to deal with the climate that we have wherever we happen to live.
Yeah.
In Italy or France or Spain, things are built differently because the climate is different. So it's when the climate changes, that's when it causes problems. Because in the UK, we have to deal with cold and hot. And now we have to deal less with cold and more with extreme heat, which we're not designed to do. And so, yes, that's why we get so many problems with our outdoor electronics or outdoor infrastructure, which isn't designed necessarily to deal with these very hot temperatures.
Yeah. I mean, was that anomaly last year when we had those 2 days? Was it historic high temperature?
Yeah, I mean, so the UK's, there's never had a day when we've hit 40 degrees.
Right.
That broke the previous record by a considerable margin.
Right.
And yes, the particular weather patterns meant that we had a heat wave, a very hot heat wave, but it probably would have been a couple of degrees colder if that same weather pattern had happened 100 years ago. And so our impact on that event is to make it hotter than it would have been, and therefore make the consequences worse.
But I mean, I'm just talking on really sort of blinkered local level. I mean, the fact of the matter is, it's, as we are very aware, it's affecting countries all around the world. That has knock-on effects that aren't necessarily, that it's hot and dry. It's civil wars. It's disruption of services. It's people fleeing because it's unlivable. That, I imagine that to be in about 50 years' time. What is happening right now, today, that is terrifying, really. There's no answer to that.
No, we are seeing these consequences affecting people, and often it's the most vulnerable in society who have not contributed to the problem in the first place. And so, we have a huge issue in that, the Western developed world has caused most of the problem, and the largest consequences are being experienced by those who haven't caused it. And that's a big problem we have to face.
And which kind of makes it, in a sense, that is the politics of it, because, the fact of mass human interaction is by definition political. It's not,
Yes.
So we have to acknowledge that. So that therefore, if you can deny the science, then you can deny that political, and then it's just lazy, greedy people trying to get in here and sponge off us, as opposed to people who can't live where they were born because it's too bloody hot.
Yeah, these are the difficult political choices that have to be made. The science says what it does, and then the politics comes into it, and it's complex, international geopolitics then, which, in one way, the science takes a step back from. In some ways, we've done our bit, right? We have convinced the world's governments that we are causing this problem. It's our choices which determine what happens next. And it is over to society at large, and governments and businesses and councils and everyone to do their bit to address the issue.
Yeah. This might be slightly out of your remit, but I'd love to know what you think about it. The difference between, because one of the big pushbacks against electric vehicles, and it's based on fact, it's not a flat earth thing, is that we have to extract billions of tons of material to produce the technology that we can then blah blah blah. That argument, which I think is perfectly legitimate and has to be faced, but the difference between doing that, and it's since I've seen actual battery recycling plants actually operating, actually producing materials out of old batteries. The difference between that and then the impact of extracting fossil fuels, transporting them, refining them, and burning them once. That's become my new mantra. But if you could burn it 10 times, there's a different argument. But you burn it once, and that's it. I guess I'm asking, do you think it's better that we dig some really big holes around the world to extract those minerals and materials, and then make sure, one, that that's done as ethically and gently as possible in a sense, and two, that we use those materials again?
Yeah, I mean, these are the difficult choices that we have to face, and there's trade-offs. Wherever you go, there are going to be trade-offs here. And if you accept that society relies on living in a stable climate, and that we have to stabilize global temperatures, then you necessarily have to make trade-offs somewhere. We have to electrify everything that we do to generate our energy, and that will necessitate digging up things from the ground. And we need to get a lot better at reusing and recycling our electronics and so on. But no, there's no simple answer here. It's all about trade-offs and choices, and they're difficult. Yeah.
But I mean, yes, I suppose the thing is, I don't know how you equate the two, but I mean, it feels to me like you dig something up once and you're using fossil fuel to run the digger, except now you're starting not to. I've seen some enormous earth moving equipment that is 100% electric. I know that Rio Tinto are converting all their massive mining trucks to electric. So there's things shifting in that world, which is completely outside the flashy world of electric cars and shiny new things. But that, the long-term carbon impact of extracting 1,000 tons of iron ore and 1 million barrels of oil, surely the mining, the digging up has got to be the beneficial choice in that scenario.
Yeah, I mean that's not for a scientist to say. But no, of course, if we can reuse things, then obviously that's clearly beneficial. Yeah.
So another thing that I really want to be able to do, Ed, is if I get in those conversations, is kind of communicate things better. And I've got a couple of grumpy old men reactions, which I'm trying desperately not to be a grumpy old man, but every now and then you do slip up. But it is the terms, the kind of casually used terms. So green, I want, I don't want to drive one of your fancy green cars. It drives me mad that a car could possibly be green. You could argue, I don't think you can even argue that a bicycle is green. Vegetables are green. Your grass is green. Everything else is a problem. So there's that one. There is eco. So you've got eco washing up powder. Really? What's it made of? I don't know. Is it made of old carrots? I don't know. And then saving the planet. I just think that one drives me bananas. I just know, if there is any sort of religious figures, one of them is the planet, and I know it doesn't give a toss about the human beings or what we're doing. It'll be fine. The planet's going to be here in 1 billion years. It might be a hot rock or a dusty vacuum, but it doesn't give a toss about us, and so we need to worry about us. I think that's
the planet will be safe. Yeah. It is about the people and the biodiversity that live on our planet. And we rely on that biodiversity. We are also facing a biodiversity crisis, which is just as important as what we're doing to our climate, because we cannot live in a world without biodiversity. And so, chopping down the rainforests and everything else that we are doing and losing biodiversity is also something that we have to face up to.
And I mean, it is a difficult one, because that is certainly a memory of my early years, is washing my windscreen of insects in the summer. I mean, it's kind of cliche,
yes,
but I've just actually washed our car for the first time since we've had it, which is now 9 months. Slightly embarrassing. And there were a lot of insects on the front of it. It wasn't like there were none, but I don't think there were as many as there were, which is, I think the insect population is definitely having
There's a well-documented decline in insects as well as many other species here and all over the world. And that brings enormous consequences, to society if we start losing species.
You're going to have to walk around pollinating our runner beans individually. It could be quite time-consuming. But I mean, I don't know what words we can use or terms we can use. I try and use terms like sustainable technology or clean technology or cleaner technology. I think I don't know. I mean, do you still talk in terms of saving planets and green technology? I mean, or do you try and avoid those, or guess you don't, they don't really come into your day-to-day stuff?
No, we don't use those terms day-to-day for sure. But I think in our communication, I think it's been very clear that there's no one size fits all.
Yeah.
A message has to be tailored for whoever you're talking to. Whether you're talking to, a group of football fans, or whether it's a group of the knitting club, or these groups that I've talked to over the years. You have to use different language to be able to communicate effectively with different groups. I agree some of those terms are potentially problematic, especially for some groups. And so we need to find ways of communicating better. And I think we also haven't done a brilliant job of talking about the positive aspects of living in a more sustainable world. We often talk about the negative consequences, and we've got to avoid those negative consequences, but we don't often talk about how the obvious example with EVs is improvements in our air quality. what that's going to do to our health all over the globe when we improve our air quality. We'd want to do this anyway, even if it wasn't for the climate challenge we face. And so having that positive vision for the future, that we'll live in a healthier world, I think is something we need to talk about more to show that it's something we want to strive for, not just something an alternative world we want to avoid.
Yeah. I mean, that is definitely certainly my generation went through a phase in the late 60s, early 70s of developing it was called the alternative society. So it was like, we would totally reject your fascist capitalism and we're going to go and live in communes, which I did. I lived in a proper hippie commune in the Welsh mountains with a wind turbine that was an absolute disaster. It was constantly breaking down. But that was a reaction to, in fact, very much to, I think that had a primary impact on me, to the oil crisis of the early 70s, was that I'd grown up in this world of motor racing. I lived near Silverstone motor racing circuit. My brother's a motor racing engineer. I was absolutely imbued with engines and noise and, all those things. And the oil crisis really made you go, oh, hang on. So it isn't just automatic. There's this thing called global trade and geopolitics. Oh God, I'm going to run for the hills, which is what I did, and then you kind of eventually go, I've actually got to get a job and earn some money. But I think there is a generation that are the people who are behind the first companies that develop big wind turbines, big solar farms, all that stuff. I think we're kind of retiring now, but that, I'm very critical of baby boomers, but there were some that were really good, that did some good stuff.
Yeah. I think, in this transition that we have to go through to net zero, we also have to make sure that it's fair.
Yes.
There is no point trying to just tell people you can't do that anymore, especially with, people who, there's societies, communities which rely on certain types of industry. And we have to find ways to ensure that those communities are helped through this transition, that there's retraining, that there's other jobs. That fairness is going to be absolutely essential if we're going to bring everyone along on this journey.
Yeah. I mean, because I suppose one of the problems is that the fact that the weather is generally a bit warmer and milder here in the UK, it's quite easy to go, I mean, it's quite nice. I didn't like the cold. That was really, the winters used to be, and I mean, what I suppose, okay, let's put that as argument aside for one moment, because what could happen is we could have a really brutal cold winter still, because we're experiencing more extreme weather. So it's not that we won't ever have snow or cold weather in the winter. It could be. Yeah. I mean, that is weather. Okay, I'm getting back to my question. I've just seen it. Weather and climate. Those two, very easily confused, and to the huge advantage of people who are opposed to what you're saying.
We'll still get, we had one a few years ago, the Beast from the East, which brought in a lot of very cold weather for us. And we had a big snow winter in 2010, I think. Right. It caused enormous problems. And so because we've got used to living in a world without so much snow in this country. Yeah. And so when that does affect us, it affects us more than it would have done in the past because we're less adapted to it. And so, yes, we will still get the occasional really heavy cold snap because that's what the weather will do. It will have knock-on effects for sure. Yeah. We need to be prepared for that. It won't be as cold as it would have been otherwise. Right. But it will still have an effect for sure. Yeah.
But then that is is that something you have to explain even to your students who I know are going to be horrifyingly intelligent and well informed, but the difference between weather and climate,
it's something we face all the time, because it's incredibly difficult to communicate. Yeah. If you live in the tropics where the weather is much more similar from day to day, it's easier. But where we live, I love living in this part of the world where the weather's so variable, right? It's interesting. But yes, we will always get cold weather. We'll always get hot weather. Yeah. It's just that it's slightly shifted, to a state where, last summer we had a wildfire that burnt down housing in London. Yes, these are the things we're going to have to face up to more regularly. And we're going to have to face those cold spells less regularly, although they will still happen from time to time.
Right. I mean, and okay, here's some last final questions. I mean, major contributors to CO2. Is that, I mean, is that an area that you have some knowledge in? Because but I mean, I'm just trying to go through them. So, obviously industry and energy, two
Yes.
big ones.
Yes.
And I am guessing ground transport on global terms is a fairly big contributor.
Everything we do contributes. Right. This is part of the challenge we face.
Yeah.
Everything we do consumes energy, and therefore releases carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. And yes, it's very tempting to say, right, well, we need to focus on this or that because that's maybe a bit bigger than that. But we have to do everything.
Right.
If we are to get to global net zero and stop the planet warming, everything has to change in terms of how we generate our electricity and everything, in how we operate as a society. And so, yes, we can, there are easier bits, right? And ground transportation is probably one of the easier ones where we can switch to electric fairly easily. Heating homes is a bigger challenge because, we have the technology. Heat pumps are amazing devices, but retrofitting them to everyone's houses is an enormous challenge that we have to somehow face and fund. And so, there are easy bits and harder bits. And some bits are going to be really, really challenging, if not impossible to stop our emissions. And that's where this net bit comes in, because there are some parts of agriculture or cement manufacture where it's going to be really difficult to stop CO2 emissions completely. And so we have to have some way of capturing carbon and storing it underground, direct air capture, take it out of the air or the ocean and bury it underground to offset the things that we can't stop doing ourselves. And so we need to save that for the really hard stuff rather than use it to counteract the stuff that we could easily change.
Right, because that was one of my sort of latter questions was about carbon capture and storage, which I've found. I think it's a double-edged sword because obviously there is without question, a role for it. It was Helen Chesky, who's one of our presenters, who's an actual scientist and can. Who, when she looked at I think the one in Iceland, the kind of one of the first kind of general air capture and storage things, it works. It uses a lot of energy, and in a year, it captures as much carbon as we release in 8 minutes globally. And then you go, oh my God, that thing has got to be so huge that it's knocking satellites because it's so enormous, as it spins around the Earth. But I mean, because I saw there's an amazing carbon capture and storage experimental system at Imperial College in London, which I saw probably 12 years ago. And it's still there, and it's still being discussed as a possible thing. It hasn't been done. It hasn't been introduced because it makes that. But do you see? So forget that, because I just think it's a red herring that the fossil fuel industry used to kind of go, no, it's all fine. Keep running your cars because we're capturing all that stuff. But in the long term, so it's say in 100 years' time, where we have to assume that we can develop technology that operates really well. Do you think that is a solution in the long term, I suppose, capturing as much carbon as we can?
I think it will need to be some sort of solution in the medium term as well. If we are to get to net zero by 2050, we need to have some fairly sizable way of removing CO2 from the atmosphere or the ocean by then.
Yeah.
And yes, that the one example in Iceland is amazing. It's powered by geothermal energy and it takes out some CO2 and buries it underground safely. But yeah, as you say, it's a tiny drop in the ocean. And so we need to save that technology for the really hard parts of the decarbonisation problem.
Yeah. And we basically...
And so, people...
Well, I was going to say...
They'll go on a flight and people will take a flight and they will... you can buy these very cheap offsets, for planting a few trees or whatever. And I think that is mainly a guilt reduction tax rather than actually doing anything very, very constructive of actually taking out CO2 from the atmosphere permanently, which is what those technologies need to be able to do.
Yeah. No, it is. I think what the kind of overall gist of our conversation is it's a really, really, really big problem, and there isn't one solution. There isn't. And I think that's a kind of natural, I think, particularly male human response. I remember having those conversations with my wife when our kids were kicking off, and I go, look, all it is this. If we do this, then that. And you went. Even as I was saying it, I went, that's such a boy response, and I know that won't solve the problem. And that was one of the things I learned with my amazing son, who is now the most glorious adult, was me being angry when he did something that annoyed me didn't make any difference. So I was angry, and he carried on doing exactly the same thing. Then I went into therapy for months and learned how to control and how to never be angry. And I didn't be angry, and his behavior didn't change one iota. It was still annoying, but I didn't get angry. And that was a really good lesson. Don't get angry, because angry doesn't solve it. But in a sense, the fact that there isn't one response is, I think, a kind of gender thing. It's like, no, it's much more complicated than that. It's much more nuanced. That is really hard for blokes. No, I'm just going to stop driving a diesel car and use an electric car, and that will solve it. No, it won't. It will solve it.
I think the other thing we need to do, so I agree with that entirely. There is no one single answer. Yeah. We need everyone pulling in the same direction. We need governments, we need businesses, all pulling in the same direction. And I think the other thing that we have to encourage is more conversations, and more talking about the problems and the solutions, because we'll talk about everything to do with society in our conversations with our friends or our family or our colleagues. We'll talk about the economy, or we'll talk about the NHS or sewage or whatever the topic of the day is. But we also need to ensure that we talk about climate and what we are doing more as well. So talk about your heat pump and how amazing it is. Talk about your electric car and how amazing it is. Or talk about what your children have told you that you need to do more of at home, and actually have those conversations with your friends and your family and your colleagues, and normalize it and make it part of normal conversation. And people will, it will gradually, be that these changes are just normal, and they're not unusual, and people will see the advantages of making these changes to the way they live their lives, and it will be enormously beneficial.
Right. I mean, in general terms, to kind of round it up, I mean, are you cautiously optimistic or hopelessly pessimistic about the chances for the human race to survive another 10,000 years?
I do oscillate a bit. I mean, most of the time, I have to be optimistic. I am optimistic. We have got ourselves into this mess, but we have the ability to get ourselves out of it. It is our fault that we are here. It is our actions that have led us to this point, and we can make the choices to reverse the problem and stop the world getting warmer. That is within our power to do. Yeah. And so we have to be optimistic that the world will see that and make those difficult choices. But it is hard to stay optimistic when you see all of these extreme weather events happening all around the world, and see the suffering that causes, and realize that that suffering is only going to get worse over the coming decades. And all of our actions, all of our choices, they make a difference, and they matter.
Yeah. That is fairly it's sobering, I think, is the term.
But it is sobering. It is sobering. But it is in our hands to make different choices.
But I mean, I think that's why we keep doing what we're doing, is because some of the potential solutions to that are also really exciting. They open up different things. I mean, when I saw, I think one of the things, I kind of, exactly like you, I occasionally hit a wall going, why am I doing this? What's the point of telling everybody about getting electric cars? It's so pointless. And then you see something like, it was actually in Utrecht, where there is a car sharing system that is very popular in the city, which means there's less private cars, which means there's less cars on the road. But the ones that are there are used more, and they're all electric, and they're all plugged into a system that takes the energy out of the car as well as puts it in. And they're now benefiting from that. At peak times, they can pull megawatts now out of all their cars to help run the city when there's low wind, no sun, cold night, blah blah blah. And when you see stuff like that, you go, that was unimaginable 20 years ago. Just even in science fiction, I never read about it. Just beyond. And the fact that that's appearing now kind of galvanizes me and go, can't keep going for a bit longer.
Yeah. And I think, there's enormous opportunities for companies, and countries to start leading the way, right? And there's enormous benefits to those people who do end up leading and developing technology, and be able to sell it around the world. And I think that's what we need to try and encourage people to look to the future and say, okay, this is an opportunity here. To make a real difference. And
I'm really going to let you go, Ed, but one last thing. So the next COP, or is it, I don't know when it is. So I went to the Glasgow one, which was fascinating.
Yes, me too.
Oh yeah, I bet, but you were probably I was only on the fringy bits. You would have been in the proper thing. But do you think that, are they worth it? Are those talking shops, have they driven stuff? Have they moved the needle or anything?
They're clearly far from perfect, right? This is an enormously complicated geopolitical problem, and they have made a difference. Is it going fast enough at the moment? No, it's not acting. We're not acting fast enough to meet the commitments that every country has made.
Right.
In 2015, every country signed the Paris Agreement to try and limit global warming to 1.5 degrees, and we are not on track to achieve that. And so countries have made promises and gone back on their word, and that's where the political challenge now is. I think they're imperfect, but we have to keep talking. Otherwise, otherwise we end up in worse trouble.
Yeah. And it's been a delight talking to you. It has, but it's also been quite chilling and sobering. And I think our audience have a lot to think about from listening to you. But it's been really interesting. Thank you so much for taking time to do this and going through.
Well, thank you for covering climate.
Yes, I think. I think it's inevitable. We have to. We can't not do it. And it's just. It is. Yeah, I think, and I also think that those resistances to it are changing. I don't think it's the same as it was 10 years ago. It is. We've kind of moved on, thankfully. But anyway, really good to talk to you. Hope to talk to you again at some point.
Yeah, I'd love to. Thank you, Robert.
Thank you. Well, I really hope you enjoyed that. I must admit, I found it I've definitely found it sobering, as we said at the end, and I definitely found it very, very thought-provoking. It's another million questions I could have asked Ed, and some of which he would have, some of which were out of his remit, because I forget, I get too excited. Some of which would, he's just fascinating. His knowledge is extraordinary. That's all. We've got a lovely show coming up in Amsterdam in a few weeks. If you're in the northwestern European region, and you want to come along to it, it's on the 24th, 25th, 26th of November. It's easy. That's easy to remember. At the Rye in Amsterdam, and it's going to be huge, and it's going to be amazing. And there's such amazing people talking. The talks are fantastic. There's some brilliant people in the Netherlands doing some incredible things, but we've also got people coming from Germany, from France, from Belgium, from Denmark. We've got amazing cars on display. We've got amazing electric boats. We've got amazing cargo bikes. You won't even believe the Dutch and their cargo bikes, off the scale. Do try and come if you're around. You can get a train from London. It's pretty easy, just saying. But anyway, that's all. As always, if you have been, thank you for listening.